I had a manager for a long time, and I had a publisher, and the press releases that would go out and talk about me would always say things like, "I've sold more than 70 million copies of my songs." I always found that really funny because somebody who sells 70 million copies of songs is going to be somebody you've heard of, and me, nobody's heard of me, right? It's kind of deceptive, but in a cool way, because if you do the math, I was lucky enough to have Celine Dion record one of my songs called Declaration of Love, and it was on her album Falling Into You. It was an album cut. Remember the days when we had album cuts, But this particular album sold 31 million copies worldwide. So, and in addition to that, my song was the B-side or the bonus cut on the All By Myself single that was released from that album. So add another million to that. And we're close to 35 million from one song. Then you have the Top Gun soundtrack, which is at 10 million. I had a song on that, another album track. So we're already at 40 million now.
45,
and
yeah.
then Eminem did a version of Toy Soldiers, which was on his Encore album and his Greatest Hits album, and that's over 10 million. So we're at 50 million with just 3 songs, and they're all, and 2 of them are album tracks. So yeah, it's pretty accurate when they say I've sold 70 million copies of my songs, but I'd like to have another hit at some point, Well, I always knew that I wanted to be in the music business, but it took me a while to figure out what my role would be. Preston Glass is a good friend of mine, and I saw his qWaqqchat, and I felt funny, like I was going to plagiarize his answer, but he and I need to connect on this because we're so similar. I used to read and study the names on record labels just like he did, and I would memorize the songwriters' names, which is always printed in very small print under the title, and I always found that if I liked a song, the same writers' names kept showing up on these songs, even though they were different artists. And so I became a fan of songwriters, people like Peter Allen and David Foster, and these names just kept popping up on the songs that I liked. I gave it a try, and in my early songs I kind of thought, well, I'm not as good as these people are, maybe this isn't for me. But I really loved the music business, and so I started to become a fan of the producers or the executive producers, names like Clive Davis. And I kind of started to think, I want to be like them. I wanted to run my own record company or be an A&R guy. And very, very early on, I think I was like 17 or 18, I got an A&R job with Curtis Mayfield for his record company in Chicago. I was from Chicago, so I was born and raised in Chicago. And that was one of the last record companies headquartered in Chicago, Curtom Records. It was a great launching pad for a career in the music business. It was toward the end of his career. It was like in the late 70s, the disco era. It was, the hits stopped happening, and eventually they closed that company down, and I felt that if I was gonna stay in the music business, I needed to move to Los Angeles. So I moved out here, and again, I tried to get an A&R job. I couldn't. I went to every label. I interviewed, nothing. So I'm out here without a job, with no connections. And I didn't know what to do, so I'm just going around record stores like Tower Records and Music Plus, and they always had these flyers and bulletin boards that said what kind of music events are happening around town. And I just wanted to just network with everybody I could and just hang out and meet people who were in the music community. And I discovered a place called the Los Angeles Songwriter Showcase. John Berhini and Len Chandler were putting this thing on. It was weekly, and they had a thing called cassette roulette. There would be a huge roulette wheel, and you put cassettes in there, and some A&R guy would come who was looking for songs for an artist, and they'd spin the wheel, and whatever song it landed on, he'd listen to it, and he'd comment on it. And the great thing about this event is that some writers actually got cuts out of that, and it was also a great way to network and meet people. That's where I met Alan Rich. We go way back to that. I started to meet writers, and then I started to do collaborations, and I started to like songwriting again. But I still wanted to be an A&R guy, so I was sort of on the fence. I wasn't quite sure which way I was going to go. But I just took any opportunity that came along. If it's going to be a writing opportunity or if it's going to be a A&R opportunity, I just took it. The first big break was getting a publisher. I've been in this business now for 30 years, and I know a lot of songwriters that always talk negatively about publishers. Don't give up your publishing, hold it. No. I'm very pro-publisher because the publishers that I've been with have been so instrumental in helping me along with my career. Not just getting me cuts, but introducing me to other writers for collaborations, managers, artists, projects, whatever. They served the purpose that they were supposed to serve back in the 80s. Publishers were like agents for songwriters. I know it's very different today. But back then, they really, really worked with me, and I loved that camaraderie. But getting a publisher, of course, was difficult because I had no track record as a writer. Through the Los Angeles Songwriters Showcase, I met a guy named Jay Graydon, legendary musician, one of the best musicians ever. Great songwriter, Grammy winner. He produced Al Jarreau and Manhattan Transfer and just George Benson, so many great records. And I managed to talk my way into being an intern for him, no paid. Anybody who knows Jay Graydon knows that one of the weird things, he was very elusive and reclusive even. It's like he slept all day and worked all night and rarely ever left his home. But he was having such a string of hits at that time that publishers and songwriters wanted to find a way to get their songs heard by him. So I ended up being that conduit. I would go out around town during the day and I'd have publishers taking me to lunch to play me songs that I can then bring over to Jay Graydon. And I got a couple of cuts that way when he was working with El DeBarge. I gave him a song for El DeBarge that I found from someone. I wasn't writing at the time. I was just connecting material with artists and producers, sort of doing the A&R thing independently. Yeah. But I made friends with all the publishers in town because of that. People like Judy Stakey at the time and Alan Molina. And also hanging around with Jay, everybody would know that one of his best friends and one of his partners was David Foster. So one day I had the opportunity to meet David Foster, who had this melody that he had written with Burt Bacharach that needed a lyric. I just asked Jay if I could give it a try, if he would mind if I just took the tape home. It was a little cassette tape and just tried it. And he's like, yeah, go for it, whatever. So I wrote a lyric to this and I sent it to David Foster. He didn't know who I was. And he called me and he's like, I don't know how you got this, but I'm glad you got it because I really like what you did with it. I really like this lyric and I'd like to go with it. And I was like, wow, I just wrote a song with David Foster and Burt Bacharach just by accident. Then I took the song to Alan Molina, who was the president of Famous Music at the time. Yeah. And he was also trying to get songs to Jay Graydon through me, so. But I'm like, you know what, I just wrote this song with David Foster, you want to check it out? It wasn't a great song, it wasn't a very commercial song, but it was a nice, pretty R&B ballad, And Alan's looked at this and was like, this kid is writing with David Foster, I'm gonna offer him a deal. That was my first publisher, Famous Music, and I was signed to Famous Music, and Famous Music was, at the time, the music publishing division for Paramount Pictures. So I became a staff writer for the music publishing division of Paramount Pictures. And one of the things that all the staff writers at that company, the perks that they got was first crack at all the movie soundtracks that Paramount was doing. And this was all new to me, but I was told maybe 4 or 5 months into my first year writing for them, I was told I'm gonna go to the Paramount lot and watch a film that's in progress. It's not a finished film. It's a Tom Cruise movie, and he wasn't a big star yet. He had just done Risky Business, but he'd never done an action film or anything. They were making the movie Top Gun, and I went to see it as a film in progress. There were no special effects in there. You'd see the planes flying with no sound effects. And I didn't know that that's the way movies were made. I'm like, if they're showing planes, why don't we hear them? I mean, it looked awful to me. I walked out of the screening thinking, this is gonna suck. I don't want to put a song in this movie. I felt that I had to do it because they were asking me to do it, so I submitted a song. And I submitted a couple songs actually, but one of them they liked. Gloria Estefan ended up recording it for the soundtrack. And then the movie came out, of course, and it was a huge hit. The album sold 10 million. It was one of the biggest soundtracks of the 80s, and suddenly I really felt like a songwriter. It was like, this is what I'm gonna do for the rest of my life. A lot of artists were cutting my songs, but I wasn't having hit singles out of them because this was at a time when the songwriter's role was very different than the producer's role. There was a songwriter, and then there was a record producer, and they usually weren't the same. You had the Richard Perrys, Phil Spectors, stuff like that. In the 80s, songwriters started producing really well-produced demos of their songs because technology was getting to the point where you can do that cheaply. The demos that I was producing were sounding better than the records that other producers. I love the producers that did songs of mine. George Duke produced one of my songs on Stephanie Mills. I love George Duke. It was great. Nick Martinelli produced some of my songs. Giorgio Moroder produced some of my songs. Yeah. Stockache and Waterman. But the thing is, they weren't as good as the demos, in my opinion, at least. And they weren't becoming hits, so I blamed it on that. A group called Five Star was coming along, and I went to my publisher and I said, they wanted to do one of my songs. I said, can we say no on this one unless they let me produce it? Alan Molina went to bat for me, which was ballsy because I'd never produced a record before, but they all met with me and they agreed. A song called The Slightest Touch, which became a top 5 hit in the UK. I mean, it's like a legendary pop song in the UK. And then I did the follow-up single, If I Say Yes, which charted here too. That kind of made me a producer. Now it's pretty obvious. Songwriters and producers do this all the time. They develop artists. But at this time, in the mid-'80s, I decided I want to find an artist, develop that artist, and basically make the album with that artist. My sister has always been working in television, and she started back in the 80s working on a show called Kids Incorporated. I remember I went to Hollywood to meet her for lunch one day, and I went to the set, and Martika was the star of this show. So I sat there and I watched Martika do a song for the show, and I'm thinking, wow, this girl is great. More than just a voice, it was about a look, it was about a personality. I just really felt that she sort of embodied what pop culture in the 80s was. And she was so into artists of that time, like George Michael and Culture Club, who were pop artists, but they were the kind of pop artists that made pop cool. And so I met with her and I met with her mom, and we just decided to start doing some demos together. And the demos came out great. And eventually we got a bunch of labels in a bidding war. Then we made the record. And it was basically meant to be a pop dance record. There was something about Martika that had more depth than I think than most pop artists have. I mean, she had a dark side, and I wanted to bring that out in one song. There has to be one song on the album, even if it's not a single. It has to be something deep and weird. At some point, I had this idea for Toy Soldiers, and I didn't really know what the song meant. She had friends who had issues with drugs and stuff, and she was very young at the time, so that was kind of a weird thing to be affected by when you're that young. We just started to write these ideas about peer pressure and about what peer pressure can do to young kids in school. And I think that's kind of where Toy Soldiers came from. But then, just on a production level, I still wanted it to get weirder. So, I remember seeing a movie called The Lost Boys, which was about, teenage vampires, remember? And there was a song in the soundtrack that was so haunting. It was called Cry Little Sister, and where the chorus was sung by a children's choir. And I thought, that's cool. I asked Martika, I said, we got to get a children's choir on here. Do you know any kids? And she's like, all of my friends on Kids Incorporated. They were like 14, 15, 16 years old. Fergie was one of them. Yeah. When Fergie was 16, she was in the Toy Soldiers choir. Yeah. But all of these kids were professionals because they were singing every week on the TV show, Kids Incorporated. Yeah. So they all had studio experience. It was great. It was so easy. We had to have a studio teacher because they were minors. Sony's freaking out. They're thinking, what is Michael J. doing? He's becoming Brian Wilson on Good Vibrations or something. I mean, they thought I was nuts. And all this time, I'm just thinking, I just want this moment on the album. I was just doing all this to have one artistic moment on the album. And of course, when the album came out, everybody heard that song and they thought, this is a great moment. It has to be a single. And when it became a single, it became a hit. If you remember back when she was skating in the Olympics, that whole story about her and Tanya Harding, that affected a lot of people. It affected me. I mean, I couldn't believe that happened to her because Nancy was such a pro. And I think she had like 2 weeks to recover from the attack. And then she went and she skated so beautifully and won the silver medal. And I was just so taken by that. And she was so popular at that one moment in time that everybody was offering her deals, sponsorship deals, commercials, everything. So I said to Alan, I have an idea. Let's just contact her manager and see if we could get her to come out to LA and just go in the studio with me and do a song. Because everybody else wanted to work with her. She hosted Saturday Night Live, huge ratings. So I'm like, if this girl puts out an album, or even a single.
Did you have any idea whether she could even sing?
No, I didn't care. I could fix it into the mix, I convinced her to do it. She came out, I booked Capitol Studios because I figured she was a big star. I wanted her to have a big room. So we did this in the Capital A. I wrote a song for her called Shining Through. She wasn't a great singer. I had a vocal coach in the session with her and they were kind of rehearsing the song line by line. Like, sing this line this way. And then I'd hear in the control room, I'd hear, okay, she's ready, press record. And we'd record one line. So, but it was fun. She was up to the task. She was a real trooper. And I always promised her that if she'd learn how to sing, I'd learn how to ice skate. Last year, I worked with a phenomenal 11-year-old boy named Ty Waters. He's young, but I really believe in this guy. We might not hear about it anymore from him for maybe 5, 6 years. When he's a teenager, I think he's going to explode. I think he could be another Bruno Mars. So I'm very excited about him. And there's a couple other artists that I'm, sort of playing around with in the studio, all new artists and stuff. But, I keep writing songs. I never stop because I think, when the day comes that you get out of bed and you don't want to write anymore, then that's a problem. Networking is still as important now as it was then. There isn't a place like the Songwriter Showcase anymore, but there are places like Hotel Cafe, the Whiskey, the Viper Room. I'm always going to see new artists perform, because you have easy access to them there. If you hear someone you like, you could walk up to them and maybe, you know, offer them a chance to write a song. You know, I mean, that's exciting to me because I'm writing with new blood all the time. I'm constantly looking for new artists. I mean, I found a band once, a rock band. I figured I'll give it a shot, which is a very different way of writing because, you know, we booked a rehearsal studio in North Hollywood and we all went in there, live band, and wrote songs together. The most important thing is collaboration, and that hasn't changed. Most songs are collaborative efforts, and I have so much fun collaborating with people, and it brings out ideas in me that I wouldn't have, and hopefully as a collaborator I do the same for my co-writers. I don't have any standard method of working, and I don't believe there should be rules in songwriting. I think if there are rules, you've got to break them. qWaqq, what a wonderful concept. We write songs and we really like our songs, and then for some reason, you know, we're the only ones that ever listen to them. Us or our friends or our family. You know, I mean, we write a lot of songs and there aren't as many opportunities available for all the songs that we write. You've actually created a place where these songs can be heard by people who are fans of great music. I would recommend that if you're somebody who loves Rihanna or Selena Gomez or Demi Lovato, you could go on qWaqc and find hit songwriters putting their songs there that are really of the same level of quality that these songs are that are on the radio. What I hope will happen someday is that maybe some A&R people will start using qWaqc and finding songs there, because there's some great songs. You got great songwriters and there's great songs. I have 100 songs on qWaqc. I put 100 songs on this thing.